Hi everybody, and thank you for coming to see this talk. My name is Lara and I'm a postdoctoral research associate at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. And it's a pleasure to be asked to be part of this Urboretum Symposium and part of the Conservation and Resilience panel. Today I want to just do a little introduction to urban risk and resilience and kind of introduce what we mean by risk and what this might look like in urban settings. Just to mention that throughout my talk I've included textual descriptions underneath each image for your reference. So just to very quickly introduce the kind of talk, first of all, I'm going to start with a basic introduction to disaster risk, what we mean by disaster risk, and introduce the risk equation. Then I'm going to talk you through what hazards might look like in an urban setting and what the kind of things we're going to be thinking about. I'm also going to introduce high impact, low probability events, which is the focus of our work at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risks, CSER. I'm also going to talk around vulnerability and in framing that in terms of global critical systems before introducing compound risks, cascading risks, and talking around a little bit of resilience. So disaster risk, and this is a really long textual definition from the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and it's a very complex description. But in reality, what it tries to do is describe what we call the risk equation. So that is hazard times vulnerability times exposure equals risk. And you may see that in other places as hazard times vulnerability equals risks. And basically what we mean is that it's some kind of shock event. So anything from a natural hazard or a terror or an error attack. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Combined with a vulnerability, so the populations of a city or infrastructure, and the interplay between these two as exposure, and that will result in a risk. The only thing also to mention here, which that description at the top also mentions, is capacity. And capacity is really important in understanding how we can absorb that risk and our ability to be able to manage the impact. So what do we mean by hazards in urban settings? And I've put these into three categories. And the first is really natural risks. And this is a picture, it's from 2018, but it could be from multiple years. And it's, of course, of flooding in Venice in St. Mark's Square, so the most famous square in Venice. And it shows some tourists wading through knee-deep water. So when we talk about natural risks, it could be things like flooding, landslides, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, wildfire, any of these kinds of natural hazards. The next is error. And of course, many of you recognize this image. And it was unfortunately demonstrated last year with the explosion that took place in Beirut late last year. Due to the improper storage of tons and tons of fertilizer within a warehouse on the port of Beirut. So that resultant blast, which I'm sure many of you have seen plenty of the photos and videos, caused around a radius of around 10 miles of damage, accidental, but human induced. And then the final category, again, another image that needs no introduction is, of course, the terrorist attack on the World Trade Centers in New York in 2001. Which resulted in many thousands of people losing their lives. And unfortunately, is another category of hazards that are posed to our urban environments. So high impact, low probability events are our bread and butter at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. So these are, you might have heard them referred to as black swans, or we also use phrasing such as global catastrophic risk, and existential risk. And so what this really means is these risks that could pose significant harm or loss to humanity. So global catastrophic risk is really one that is perhaps recoverable, and it may just negatively impact upon our societies. Whereas existential risk is really the survival of humanity. And we're talking about near annihilation of the human race. So these are categories of risk on that very extreme end. So what do we talk about when we mean global catastrophic risks or existential risks? And again, they've got that category of natural risks. So we've talked around earthquakes and landslides and flooding. We're talking more extreme events here, and we're thinking around that asteroid impact of the kind of dinosaur extinction type, a large scale impact that could really wipe out humanity. Also in that category, you have things like solar flares or supervolcanic eruptions, the likes of Yellowstone, I'm sure you've heard in the media. Biological risks, of course, need very little introduction now. We're living through a pandemic situation, although we don't consider COVID-19 to be a black swan event or a global catastrophic risk. We are definitely still vulnerable to large scale, really high impact kind of pandemics, and the 1918 Spanish flu is an example of that. Other things are like the manufacture of kind of pathogens for release through terror cells and things like that. Luckily, we're technologically far away from that kind of scenario, but they're on our radar. Technological risks, and really we focus on artificial intelligence, the risks associated with the development of artificial intelligence. Could we create machines that are truly intelligent? And if we do, might they believe that the best thing for humanity is not to exist? And so there's lots of ethical and philosophical questions that we think about when we think about artificial intelligence. And it's really about control and regulation of dealing with this technology before it gets out of hand. Nuclear risk, and you might be surprised to see that on here and thought that kind of risk had diminished, but unfortunately it's still very present. There's still 14,000 nuclear weapons in the global arsenal. This year, just at the end of this year, the start of this year, last year, the start of this year, we saw the ratification of the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty. So that's a really positive step, but it's still very present and prescient threat. And environmental risks obviously need slightly less introduction and much more on our radars. And we're thinking in there about climate change and the impacts that humans are creating on our own climate. And drivers of extreme weather change and actual physical climate change, but also biodiversity loss and what that can mean in terms of the release of new pathogens and the loss of species that's potentially irreversible. So coming to the dimensions of vulnerability next, and we really use the framing of global critical systems when talking about vulnerability and critical systems and infrastructure. And so we're kind of defining these as the networks and commodities our societies need to sustain themselves and to enable their continued development. So they are really the lifelines of our societies. That's things like fuel, oil and gas, electricity, food, precious metals and other rare commodities. Things like the transportation networks that provide us with all of these things. The climate system is another one. And obviously humans, our populations within our cities are of course a major point of vulnerability for us. So it's thinking about that next component on the risk equation. So I just want to talk to you really quickly about a kind of case study that I think is a really nice one to demonstrate our kind of vulnerabilities in urban environments, and that's the Northeast blackout of the US and Canada in 2003. So you might remember this as the event when New York went dark. So in 2003, there was an error in the electrical grid, which caused the total wipeout of the electricity to the Northeast. It's 55 million people that encompassed, including New York City. It happened towards the end of the day, around August time, just as commuters were all heading home from their day of work. So instantaneously, communication networks, transportation networks, water supplies, all of it was just wiped out. So that meant that there was no subways and people couldn't get home. And you can see pictures of people marching across the Brooklyn Bridge. And many commuters actually had to spend the night in New York. And this is commuters sleeping on the steps of the New York post office. The only lights were from cars and generators. The city was in total darkness. People scrambled to buy candles, and that's what that image there is on the right, is people desperately trying to buy torches and batteries and candles. People were caught unaware and unprepared. And so the blackout lasted around 7 hours, which is not very long. It's a short, sharp shock. But it was enough to kind of rattle the system. Politicians were instantly concerned that they'd found a weakness that could be exposed by terrorists and exploited. The thing is it wasn't the first time that this had happened. In 1965, a very similar event had happened, and little had been done in the interim periods to make sure that that electric grid and that system, that critical system for those cities and those populations were made to be robust, resilient, and ready for any exogenous shocks. So I just wanted to introduce you to the concept of cascading risk, and this is something I really focus a lot in my research. And this kind of concept of cascading risk, and the reason for introducing you to the Northeast Blackout case study, is really around how you can have an impact of a shock event that affects one critical system, this vulnerability that we've talked about, and how an overwhelming kind of surge onto that one system can then instigate a chain reaction and create a similar shock or a similar kind of failure in an associated and integrated system. And our world and our systems are incredibly interwoven and interconnected. You can see that in the spread of COVID-19 and how quickly that spread for our global transportation networks. So basically what you get is a proliferation from disaster to potential catastrophe of one simple shock that can be a ripple effect through the system that can then cause multiple failures. So an example of that might be, for example, a global warming causing extended periods of drought, which in turn, so that's the climatic system, could then cause failures of harvest, which then impacts on the food system, as prices then hike on as food insecurity issues proliferate. And then you have issues with inequality and higher levels of poverty. So it's about this connection into the system for it proliferating into this large scale catastrophe from something that we should easily be able to otherwise have walked through. But us making our own vulnerability by the way in which we connect our own systems and our reliability on these systems that we have developed. So I've just put in some examples, and my background is in volcanic risk, so I couldn't resist the urge to use some volcanic examples. And I'm going to just talk these really quickly just to give you a little hint of what this might look like. And some of you may have been acquainted with the 1815 Tambora eruption in Indonesia. And this eruption really famous for its Year Without the Summer and the Lord Byron and Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein and these wonderful stories that came with it. But the Year Without the Summer was actually caused by the injection of mass quantities of ash and gas up into the upper atmosphere. This ash and gas affecting our climatic system caused a global climate anomaly. We had extra cold, well, in 1816, that led to an extra cold summer. They actually had snow on the ground in the Northern Hemisphere, which is kind of unheard of. That led to crop failures. Ultimately, that led to food insecurity and famine. And there was even reports of civil unrest and disorder as poverty and inequality increased. So a more recent example, and my Icelandic isn't brilliant, so I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it. I'm going to call it the Icelandic eruption in 2010 that many of you will probably remember. And this was a small-scale eruption that did a similar thing to Tambora. It released this ash column into the atmosphere, which was swept across Europe through the climatic system and led to the closure of European airspace. So that led to the disruption to all air travel, cargo, freights, and passengers. So thousands of passengers were stranded all over the world. This led to a mass repatriation effort from countries all over Europe to try to get their citizens home. But it also had a massive knock-on effects to the cargo and freight that these planes and normally typically transport. So that meant the loss of masses of perishable goods like flowers and food, but also a real disruption to our just-in-time supply chains. Many of our supply chains have developed this way of being that so they don't have to store and they don't have to have lots of land and buildings to store these kind of warehouses and things. So yeah, the disruption of the just-in-time supply chain meant that there was not the right pieces and the parts to develop the machines and the manufacturing that we needed to. And so it actually led to quite substantial loss in GDP. 5 billion is the estimated loss in GDP from the 2010 eruption. It remains the most expensive volcanic eruption in history. So now I just want to move on to another concept, which is compound risk. And this one I think is particularly interesting for our urban settings. And this is when you have the interaction of one or more hazard within a short time frame or a geographical location, resulting in an amplification of the risk. So when we talk about this in terms of these hazards, it's all of those things that we've talked about before. They could be natural disasters, they could be acts of error or terror. And OCHA have released, kind of are thinking around this aspect of compound risk, and they use the compound risk monitor. And that this basically is designed to understand if we can map places in the world where there's a higher vulnerability to the onset of compound risk based on their geographical location in terms of exposure to natural hazards, and exposure to or increased likelihood of food insecurity issues associated with civil unrest, and whether we can map these places to identify high areas of vulnerability. So they came up with a list of drivers, and this is where this comes from, this graph on the right. And you can see there's a couple of drivers on here. So they break it down to environment, which is these natural hazards. COVID-19, of course, is a new one, and pressures on the health systems and things like that. Response, and that's like how the capacity to deal with an exogenous shock. Macroeconomic shocks, anything towards the financial systems, or any shocks to that kind of economic side. Food insecurity, conflict and fragility, and socioeconomic, so levels of inequality and poverty. And basically where you have layering of these risks or these drivers of risk in one small geographical area, you can then have this concept of a compound risk. So an example of that would be Puerto Rico in 2017 that unfortunately received a Hurricane Irma, and just 2 weeks later also then felt the impacts of a direct hit from Hurricane Maria. They were already struggling to respond and recover after the first hurricane before then being hit with the second hurricane, developing this compound risk and amplifying the impact of that risk. The other thing to just say here is that you can actually have a compound risk where perhaps your resilience drops to one of these drivers. So for example, COVID-19 is pushing health systems around the world to the edge of their capabilities. And now we're entering complex problems and regions of disaster where we haven't previously anticipated with this kind of global pandemic crisis. And we're seeing this interaction of these drivers. So it's more about removing away from this siloed thinking of risk and thinking much more holistically around what this risk might look like. So now just to move on to resilience, and I just really want to just talk to you very briefly here around what we mean by resilience and the components of resilience. And so we kind of mean about resilience is our ability to adapt, to transform, and to recover from a hazard event, and our ability to take those lessons in, make ourselves stronger, make ourselves more robust, and be able to deal with that again in the future. So this diagram here kind of comes from a body of literature on resilience and kind of components of resilience. And they kind of break it down to these individual components. And so the first is redundancy. And redundancy is very much understanding how that we can, maintain our systems in a different way of, so removing any duplications, but also being able to achieve the same capacity in our systems through a different way. So if something was to take out the electric grid in New York, do we have another way that we can maintain that service, that system, that is without having any duplication, a bit more robust in rigor? The next is diversity, so being flexible in response to shock events and adapting to the situation that unfolds. Inclusivity and equity, so that's really important in thinking about collective action. Within highly unequal societies, it becomes more difficult to maintain stability and reduce the ability, and it also reduces the ability to implement risk reduction policies. So it's really important that we have we kind of think about this in terms of a component of risk and resilience and understanding the role of inclusivity and diversity, and equity. Modularity as well is a kind of reducing the interconnected nature and the interwoven nature of our global critical systems and making them more robust and rigorous resilient to exogenous shocks. And adaptive learning, the last one, is the capacity to learn from mistakes and reinforce those lessons and make changes on the lessons that we've kind of experienced. So the examples there for me are, of course, the Northeast Blackout, which in 1965 they'd already experienced something fairly similar, but also from the Icelandic volcano eruption. The UK never added volcanic risk to the National Risk Register in 2012 after that eruption. But actually, there was a long record of Icelandic eruptions affecting the UK, from Grimsvötn and Laki, from history. But yet this hadn't been built into our kind of logical thinking about risk reduction and resilience. So just thinking very quickly and just kind of finalizing here on some of actions that can be taken towards resilience. And first is really understanding the risks by really thinking about what they are, understanding their nature, understanding their probabilities through mapping and through modeling. It's a really important step in understanding how to build resilience. If you don't understand the risk, how can you build resilience towards it? Forecasting possible futures, and this is something we really focus on at the Centre for Study of Existential Risk. We do lots of scenario planning and horizon scanning with experts in certain areas of risk to understand kind of what these futures might be, what's the worst case scenario, and really understanding this possible step and how we need to prepare for the very worst case. So then identifying the vulnerabilities. If you know your risk, if you know your hazards, you know what you're physically exposed to, and you know what the impact might be, then it gives you a really good kind of foundation to understand what the risk could look like and how to take resilient steps. Reducing the drivers of risk, but also building capacity to deal with the shocks. So thinking around things like chaos engineering. So just very quickly to explain that, maybe you've often wondered why your Netflix never goes down or that never goes through buffering or anything like that. And that's an example of chaos engineering. They have this thing called the Chaos Monkey that they release into their server rooms. It's a piece of code that's designed to sabotage the systems so that they can make them much more robust and resilient. And so they can make them much more able to deal with exogenous shocks. Therefore, if you design your systems with faults and kind of thinking about these weaknesses, you can actually develop and create more robust and rigorous systems. Long-term thinking, again, this is one of our remits at CSER, and we very much think around the future generations, but we also want to think outside of terms of office. So in dealing with some of these more high impact, low probability events like climate change, we need to have a much longer view and a lack of changing opinions. Of course, the US is an example of that, changing between presidencies and the approaches to dealing with climate change, a key one that's been on the table of late. Participatory approaches and the inclusion of the public in what we do in terms of our resilience is super important. And France and the UK have been leading the way with their uses of citizen assemblies for the climate on the House of Commons Climate Assembly and the Convention Citoyenne sur le Climat, also in France, which has also been incredibly successful. Participatory approaches, inclusion of voices of those most effective, make them the policies and the things that come out of the back much more robust, much more rigorous, and much more able to be accepted by those populations that are most affected. And finally, and really the last lesson that I really want you all to take away with you from this talk is that we must learn from the lessons of the past. If we ever are unlucky enough to really feel the effects of a black swan event or a high impact low probability event, we don't have the opportunity to learn from that for the next one. It could be the last one. So it's really important that we learn from these smaller ones, and COVID-19 is a perfect example for us to understand the lessons. Where were our weaknesses? How could we have dealt with this situation better? How can we strengthen our systems to cope? And so that's really where I want to leave this, is just by kind of saying that we must take the lessons from our experiences, from our knowledge, and make ourselves more resilient and more prepared for these kind of urban risks. So I'll leave it there. I just wanted to say a big thank you. And here's my contact details if you feel like contacting me, no problem at all. It's my email and my Twitter. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you on the panel on Friday. Thank you.